So, welcome to the Honi office. Could you just begin by telling us your name, degree, and year of study?
Sure, I am Josie Jakovac and I am in my second year of Commerce and Law here.
Cool. And could you just tell us your campaign name, colour, and slogan?
Sure, so I'm running with the Boost team, and our colours we're running on white with purple print and a purple logo, and campaign slogan. Essentially, it's students deserve better services. Our entirety of our campaigns focus on that student welfare and student services. So.
And could you tell us who's managing your campaign?
Sure, Laura Glaze and Julia Kokich
Cool.
are my two campaign managers.
Cool. We'll move on to your factional affiliations. Could you tell us a bit about that?
In what sense?
Are you a member of any factions on campus?
On campus or off campus or both?
Both.
Okay, well, yes, I'm a member of the Liberal Party, and part of the Moderate Liberals.
What drew you to the Mod Libs when you started uni here? As opposed to other Liberal factions?
Honestly, I signed up to the Liberal Party after I graduated from high school, and I just knew people in this group. It was the closest. Yeah, I just knew people. And my friends were there, so I wanted to be there too, and it aligned with my values.
And what would you say those values are that drew you to the Liberal Party in the first place, in a nutshell?
I mean, the values we espouse, the individualism, that freedom of expression, that very that results-driven, I suppose, outlook to things, and the incredible value in hard work and reward therein.
How do you see the relationship between your membership of the Liberal Party and your candidacy for SRC president? Are those how do those two sort of identities interact?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, and there's very much expecting you to ask. I mean, I am a proud member of the Liberal Party, just like I'm a member of, the Evangelical Union here on campus, just like I'm a member of the Slavic Society, and actively involved in a lot of not-for-profits outside. It's just part of who I am, and I think that the role of the president is to speak on behalf and in the best interest of students, and to do that you really do need to listen to students. So I think as we'll continue this interview, we'll find out, I'm sure you asked me ways and we'll kind of see practical examples of that, but it's very much listening to the student body, and I think that my own private political thoughts and opinions will have no sway on my presidency, because at the end of the day, I myself and our entirety of our team, we're all about putting students first, making sure for every dollar of their fees that the SRC spends, they feel a direct benefit from that.
So you would say your political alignments and your candidacy are somewhat discrete or separate? I
think there is a very clear role as president, and I think that while my own private politics might influence the way I see certain things, I'm a very reasonable, very open, very understanding person, and I do love that sort of robust discussion, and so I think that I can keep the two identities separate without having one sway the other.
What kind of input did your faction or did your party have in determining your policies, or how did you go about determining your policies? Was it particularly consultative? Do you see your policy platform as representative of your views, of your faction's views, of the entire student body's views? How did you go about
No, so I just want to clarify that the Boost team, the majority of the Boost team are actually proudly independent students that don't have any ties to political organisations, and that was very deliberate, because if you want to represent the student body, you can't do so if you interact with one certain grouping. And so, I've been from the get-go, and from shaping each and every one of my policies, it's making sure that we have consulted with students. In fact, Boost and I am proud to say I genuinely do think, and so does the rest of the team, that we are a very good representation of the entirety of the student body, and it was their voices, things from, just sitting down and chatting to students, or having a flick through YouTube rants, or those sort of things, my involvements in clubs and societies that have directly formed my policies that I'm running on, and I know that the ticket heads have done the same.
Running would it be fair to say that you're sort of characterising yourself as an independent in trying to separate your private political views and your candidacy?
I think that I don't want to mislead the student body in saying that I am not a member of the party, because I am. But again, as I was saying, it's just one part of the bigger picture that is Josie. And sorry, can you repeat the question though, Ben? You were asking...
Well, I'm just sort of asking whether it would be fair to say, you've said that you kind of want to distinguish your sort of private, personal membership of the Liberal Party and those affiliations with your candidacy. You don't want them to be conflated.
That's true.
I'm just asking whether it would be fair to characterise you as an independent candidate.
I think it's fair to characterise me as running an independent as running an independent campaign, a proudly independent campaign.
Okay, but as a candidate yourself, would you call yourself an independent?
For the SRC presidency, yes.
Okay, that's the strategy that's been used by a lot of Liberal aligned student politicians recently and in the past. Why do you think that's a trend? Do you think there's any kind of... Do you think when students hear that someone's a member of the Liberal Party, there's a certain image that's conjured in their mind that perhaps you're trying to evade, or do you think it's maybe misrepresentative of your views?
If I was trying to evade the fact that I was a member of the party, I wouldn't be so forthright about it. I honestly, the reason why we can say that we're running an independent campaign and I am running independently is that we are not, listening to... You asking me, what informed my policy platform. We're not running on policies that were dictated to us by some other group. We're running on policies, and we're running for students, and we are a team of... majority of our students don't have any sort of... a majority of our team don't have any sort of political affiliation, so we're running for students. And so we can proudly say, and honestly say, that we're a team of independent-minded students who are running for this. So I don't think there's any conflict or misleading.
Okay, all right. We'll move on from that topic. If you were to be elected, what would next year look like for you? Would you take a year off uni? Would you drop your study load? How would you sort of balance? It's obviously a huge commitment. It's basically a full-time wage that you're paid. How would you balance that?
Well, it is the equivalent of a full-time salary on the minimum wage. And yeah, you're right, the presidency is an incredibly demanding job. It's a difficult job, and it does require a lot of commitment. And so there's two ways you can go about answering this, because obviously, it deserves, and it's a role that deserves that 9 to 5 commitment. That's the amount of, 9 to 5 days a week. That's the amount of hours that you have to put in realistically. There's, I think, 19 committees/boards in total this year that Jackie has had to sit on. 7 of those are specifically called committees. And, with those sort of committees, you would require to meet up with staff beforehand, consult with the rest of the student body, and you'll see on my policies, I want to have those face-to-face consults with students. And so, yeah, that in one sense, yes, I would need to be putting in those hours, and that is my commitment. I will put in those hours. But on the other side of this question, how on earth are you supposed to lead the student body if you're detached from it? So I would still be going to my classes and keep up my involvement with, all the societies and things like that I'm involved in now, because I think it's important. Otherwise, you risk having an SRC that is severely detached and disconnected from student issues. So even if I cannot be in the office from 9 till 5, I still want to go to my classes. I will be here when I don't have class. But whatever hours that I will lose because I am in class, I'll make up for those in other places like home and things, to make sure that I'm committing and upkeeping that workload.
So you'd commit to doing a full-time study load at the same time, so that would be 4 units.
Yep.
And you're a commerce law student, is that right? So that's a fairly...
Oh, it's a heavy load, but I've done it before.
hands-on degree.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that... there's only so many hours in the day, right? Like, you're conceding that it is, a 40-hour-a-week job. You're also doing a very demanding degree. Are there really enough hours in the day? You just said there's 19 committees, etc.
Sure.
Are there enough hours in the day for you to manage all those commitments?
To be honest, yes, there are. I've done it before. I've been in a position where I'm doing a full-time study load, and I am working I'm actually working 8 till 6. That was my hours, and I managed to get it all done. There's ways around it, right? We're very fortunate to have summer school and winter school, so we'd be looking at some of those avenues as well. While I'll still be completing a full-time study load, there's obviously ways around it so that during semester I can still commit to the students just like they deserve to have.
Do you think it might be it would be fair to say it's kind of a disservice to students if they're paying you a full-time wage to be working part-time? Because you are...
I'm not working part-time, no. I'm being very clear that I'm going to be committing to it in the capacity of a full-time.
It's a physical impossibility to work a full-time job and do a full-time study load. There's just simply not enough hours in a week to do...
There are
to do 40 hours of work a week. and which is what's expected of you if you're committing to something that has a full-time salary, and studying 4 units of commerce and law, which are two very
I mean, I'm going to
intense
concede
degrees.
that obviously my marks are going to suffer because of this, but the students will always come first. And so, you know, at the moment, this is what I'm saying. But, you know, we can, at the moment, what I'm saying, you'll see it in practice next year if I'm elected, that I will be able to juggle all of this. And if it means I have to do summer school, if it means that I have to do winter schools, if it means that, you know, my sleep habits are going to, you know, the students have to come first. So regardless, my studies, I will concede that they will probably drop next year. But I'm committing to students, and so I will commit to this role.
It might be kind of hard, though, don't you think? You've talked about the importance of consulting with students. A lot of presidents, or some presidents have sort of committed to consultation-style sessions with students, drop-in consultations. If you've got all these time commitments, right? You know, all these committees, you've got a lot of class, a lot of study to do. It's going to be very hard, you know, unless you're holding consultation hours in the middle of the night or whatever, or on weekends, which are obviously impractical hours for students. That's kind of something you can have to rule out, right, if you're committing to a full-time study load during the week.
I honestly, like, my studies next year, I will be graduating from the commerce side of my degree, and there is no reason why I can't take my business electives during winter. Like, of course I'm going to have and upkeep those student consultations because those face-to-face consults are important, but I genuinely will juggle everything. And to be honest, if push comes to shove and I do have to cut something, it would be my units of study.
Mm-hmm.
Is that why you're running this year, in that next year you have room to sort of let your marks drop a little bit?
I have, it's probably something to, to be honest, yes. I do have options for a graduate job at the end of my degree already. There's a few options that I can take, a few offers I've already had. So in terms of my marks, you know, the students are my first priority, and my marks would be my second priority moving to next year.
The SRC's faced a number of issues both last year and this year with paid OBs being away or sort of MIA for extensive periods of time. The General Secretary, one of the General Secretaries both last year and this year comes to mind, as well as Jackie at certain points during this year. Do you have any plan to kind of combat that tendency for certain OBs to kind of neglect their duties?
I think leadership by example, right? So I have no plans of going overseas next year at all. Absolutely zero plans of going overseas next year, and I think it requires to prevent those sort of things, I guess, being very clear with everyone at the start of the year what their responsibilities are, what their commitments are, and I'd encourage anyone who is, you know, running for this to really consider, you know, if they are planning on going overseas, you know, are they really the right person to be running for this? Because I can confidently say, you know, I'm not going anywhere.
Have you considered, obviously this year, the VP stipend was introduced for the first time. Some people have kind of speculated that part of the reason that was introduced was because Jackie, as president, was unable to fulfill his entire workload, taking on a full-time study load. His predecessor took a year off uni, whereas this year that workload was spread amongst the VPs, whereas usually the VP has been sort of more of a honorary role. Would you consider reforming stipends at all further, or are you happy to leave them as they are?
I think stipends should stay how they. I don't see I don't see a reason to change the stipends. It's not on our agenda for next year at all. And I don't know if it's a correct characterization to say that it was because of his study load, as opposed to just recognizing that the VPs actually should take a much more active role in council. You know, I think it's actually a shame that we have, you know, honorary positions. I think, you know, everyone's elected has that inherent duty of, you know, really committing to the role and making something of it. And I don't think anyone should be, you know, sitting idle and just using it as a token position, you know. And so I think I think that's why the changes came about. But no, I don't have any plans for next year to change stipends.
Speaking of positions, can you sort of walk us through what you've achieved this year, being on the SRC and obviously in your role as a member of General Executive?
Sure. So this year has actually been really great. We have had a number of things that we have, I think, done really well. One of them was, you will see, is a textbook subsidy program that really kicked off this semester. And so because of that, you have 400 low socioeconomic students this semester who are getting $100 subsidies for all of their books. And so that was a change that I helped lead, and it's fantastic to see. And, we've done so much like that on council this year with those sort of student services. And yeah, I've been an active part of those. Yeah, so it's been good. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, but I'm ready to, I guess, take that step up and take on more responsibility now that I understand sort of how it all works.
Do you want to continue from there?
Yeah. So we're going to move on to student service and amenities fees.
Sure.
Do you believe that the allocation over the past few years has been equitable? What would you change about that?
In what sense?
Between the 5 student organisations.
Yeah.
Well, obviously you've got different. Are you asking me in terms of what I would change in the budget, the actual allocation,
We're just asking you, like, in your opinion, do you think that the allocation, the staff allocation between the SRC, the USU, etc.,
between the different bodies,
has been equitable or has been productive? Do you think there's any need for example, do you think there should be more given to the SRC at the expense of a certain other student organisation, or just in your general opinion?
I really think that with whatever student money that we get allocated by the university, that we should be our first and foremost our focus before we look into any of that should be using whatever money we do have effectively and efficiently. And so I think that will require us sitting down and really thinking of our own budget first, thinking obviously there's frontline services that we shouldn't touch the funding to, the base that stays and is part of our budget every year. I think that should stay as is. And a very firm believer of that because that's how it's always been. But yeah, no, look, I honestly think that there's ways that we can use our own, whatever money we do have, more efficiently. And then obviously if we do need it, there's always ways of applying to the university for additional staff funding, but that would be a case-by-case basis, not a general sort of statement.
One of your policies on ending student hunger is putting pressure on the USU to drop its food prices. Hypothetically, obviously you have no control over this, but would you support, for example, like lowering the SRC's allocation to allow the USU to dedicate more to lowering its food costs?
So in terms of that policy commitment, I have been doing a lot of research into this and been talking to a lot of students on campus, and we all concur that there's actually studies that say 1 in 7 students, so almost 15% of students are currently skipping main meals because they actually can't afford them, such your lunches and your dinners, and I don't think that's acceptable. I think how on earth are you supposed to commit to your studies and commit to all your other facets of your life if you're going hungry? In this country we're so fortunate, and in this city, in this university, there's so many people who are so fortunate, and I think it's really shocking that we're not addressing this issue head on. And so I guess my policy platform and how I changed that was not only lobbying the USU to drop their prices, but also holding fortnightly food drives for students. In terms of the USU, I think the best way of going about it is just, lobbying and applying pressure. And you might ask, why don't you just, that might be a USU thing. I think it's because students need that action now. Students are going hungry now, and we need to act because we can't afford to have so many of them fall through the cracks. We need to put our priority and our focus back on student services and student welfare.
What would those food drives look like? Can you walk us through like the specifics of that, the budgeting, etc.?
I mean, you'd have to look at the budgeting. Obviously, they've changed the way that the SRC budgets are put together this year. So in October is when we start, October this year is when you start looking at the staff fee allocation. So around that time, if I'm elected, so obviously straight after, the elections would be straight away focusing on, how to allocate and apportion money to make that happen. But in a practical sense, what that would look like, I really want to synchronise these food drives with the youth allowance cycle. So youth allowance is paid every Monday, and so then holding the food drives on the Friday before when money is starting to run thin, and it could look, it's so simple in terms of cooking up in winter, cooking up a big thing of soup and bread, and if I have to allocate or spend some of my own presidential stipend on making sure that happens, I will, because it's a priority.
Speaking of priorities, you've mentioned promising a dedicated sexual assault
Yes.
lawyer. This has been something that candidates have proposed many times.
Mhm.
It's never happened.
Yep.
How would you make it happen?
Well, look, I think it's really disappointing that so many people have run on it and not actually translated it into results, because we saw from, the Australian Human Rights Commission, their survey that they did, that 51% of students here at Sydney Uni have experienced, unfortunately, some sort of sexual harassment, and I think that's really disheartening. I have some people on my own Boost team who are victims of this as well, and so I've been listening to them when we are constructing these sort of policies. And I have to say, Jackie he was actually the first president ever to, while everyone ran on these promises before, he was the first president ever to actually apply for the university for that funding. And so, as you will see on our budget, there's actually some money set aside for an extra solicitor. So it'd be then working with him in October, making sure that money becomes part of the permanent baseload, so we can actually, from next year onwards, have that dedicated solicitor.
On the topic of your sort of more sort of social justice oriented policies, you promised to stamp out racism, violence and discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
Can you sort of give us a bit more detail on this policy?
I think that there are, actually, to be honest, last night's council was a very good a depiction of this. We have so many instances on campus of students being mistreated. I think that we have an obligation to make sure, we cannot tolerate any sort of harassment, intimidation, bullying, discrimination on these sort of basis of in its broader sense. We see a rise in anti-Semitism on campus. We see, I have been discriminated against because of my own ethnic background and things like that, and I think that there is no place there. So it's fostering, I suppose, that culture of acceptance, of decency, making sure that looking at the way maybe councils are run, elections are run, to really wean out that sort of toxic culture that certain groups seem to propagate on campus, and really completely stamping that out, because we can't tolerate it anymore.
Would you say you would strive to lead by example in that regard?
Of course.
On that topic, in July last year, you made a Facebook status that was fairly controversial, in which you referred to the French national football team as Africa. Would you say this is a pretty good example of the kind of casual racism and discrimination that you're talking about?
What sort of post? I don't actually recall.
So you made a Facebook status in July last year, around the time of the World Cup,
okay,
or on the day of the World Cup final, I'm assuming, in which you said, "What a fantastic game against Africa. Despite dodgy VAR calls, a small stampede of political activists," and you went on to talk about the outcome of the World Cup.
Right.
The term Africa was a derogatory term coined during the World Cup to refer to the French national team, sort of coined in reference to the fact that a large proportion of the team were first and second generation African immigrants. Don't you think that's a fairly good example of the casual discrimination you're talking about?
No, I don't think so. I think that was I wasn't aware of, that sort of derogatory sense that was surrounding that word at the time. I think, it was a dumb Facebook post by a dumb kid,
That was
at the time.
like just over a year ago.
I think that honestly, I think I was it was over a year ago, right? So it's been, 12 months and we're at this point now. And I think that with that post, I was more in terms of referring to ethnicity as opposed to I did not mean any sort of derogatory term by that whatsoever.
Well, I guess in the year since, how have you sort of overcome what seemed to be quite anti-black?
In what sense?
How have you practiced,
I think that's incredibly offensive. I have so many friends from that sort of background, and they know that the sort of the absolute respect that I always give to them. I don't look at anyone or discriminate according to the colour of their skin. I'm a person of...
Hasn't that comment, it's largely, as Joe explained, it's looking at a group of people and deciding they're all Africa, and wouldn't that be discrimination? So I'm saying how, in what ways can you sort of show the student body through your actions of anti-racism? How have you done that throughout the year?
I think the amount of motions that we've passed, the amount of things I've been doing behind the scenes to make sure that that sort of behaviour is not tolerated. You're speaking out against violence towards different races, against different races on campuses and things. I've taken a very proactive stance of, in every conversation I have, everything that I do, making sure that I'm not discriminating on basis of any grounds. I think that's completely wrong and it shouldn't be tolerated.
Let's maybe move on to an example of actual tangible policy. The fact that international students are denied concession opal cards is often pointed to as an example of discrimination against international students that affects them in a very real economic sense. How would you go about tackling that issue?
Obviously, we are not the government of the day. We are the SRC. And I think that and the rest of the team thinks that when we approach this terrible disparity, the gap between domestic and international students, it needs to go. You know, at the end of the day, we're all students. And I suppose to conquer this divide, to move beyond that, my policies, you're looking at things, you're talking about practical economic impact, you know, it's helping in terms of, you know, that stress, that additional stress of perhaps like visa and migration support, like I've said, in terms of job opportunities, the language barriers and things like that. So taking a much more practical, you'll see this semester actually, that later in the year, Supra and the SRC are coming together and we're holding a careers fair. And so you'd see more initiatives like that, you know, boosting and strengthening the WeChat platform and things like that. That's our focus for next year. So you don't want to go promising students the world and not delivering. So we feel like all of those, and we honestly, more than just feel, we think that all of those policy platforms are very achievable. As you will see, lobbying to hire a dedicated caseworker for international students.
But on the specific issue of concession opal cards, do you have a stance? Is that something you would advocate for it, or is that something you don't consider a priority?
I think that it's wrong to run on policy platforms that you can't actually achieve in 1 year.
But you can commit to lobbying, right? That's not.
No, of course you can commit to those sort of things, but you know the policies that I'm putting forward. Pardon?
Is that of lobbying?
I am definitely for lobbying in favour of international students.
Concession opal cards?
In terms of all that, you don't want to go...
So not concession opal cards?
If it's concession opal cards that they're international students, role of president is to speak what the council says. If the council comes forward and says that international students need concession opal cards, then of course I'll be taking that and lobbying with the university about international students' concession opal cards, because that'll be my job.
You would defer to the council on that issue?
I would not defer, I'd listen to the council on that issue and a numerous array of other issues, because that's what a president should do.
So you would reflect the views of the council on that issue?
On that particular issue, sure.
Right. So if the council, in a majority form, came to you and said, "This is something we want you to lobby for," that's something. Okay. On the issue of international students, a lot of people have commented on and noticed the fact that there's been a particular wave of xenophobia, both on campus and sort of in the broader Australian community over the past couple of months. It's been exacerbated in a large part by the Hong Kong protests. Obviously, we saw that manifested in a very real way just above our heads at JFR when there was a racist attack carried out on an international student about a month ago. It's a very tricky area in which you have to balance, obviously there's competing interests, there's freedom of political expression, there are racist undertones to a lot of movements, both on campus and in the broader community. How would you go about sort of limiting the effects of xenophobia on Chinese international students, whilst at the same time supporting their right and others' rights to, to speak about, issues relating to China, Hong Kong, etc.
So that's a very broad, very
big
question.
That's a very wordy question, but how would you go about sort of, we've seen like Lennon walls taken down, that kind of thing. What would your stance be on sort of upholding the values of freedom of speech whilst at the same time limiting sort of xenophobic sentiment, anti-China sentiment, and allowing international students to still feel safe on campus?
I think that we have a priority to make sure that regardless of any person's background, that they feel safe and welcome on campus. You know, at the end of the day, everyone's a student here, and they should be treated with respect, courtesy, and just general decency. They shouldn't be discriminated because of their background. I am a big proponent of freedom of speech. I think, if you're asking in terms of me personally, what I would be doing as president next year, in terms of I can talk about it in terms of, to narrow it down a little bit, because it's such a broad question.
Yeah.
I don't believe in censorship of the sort of public places and things like that. The regulations are very clear that the role of the president, I will focus in on Honi because it's easier to do so, because it's such a the role of the president is limited to censoring anything that has something that's defamatory or might incur any sort of legal action on the SRC and all the other representatives and people that would be embroiled in those sort of cases. So that is my role for next year, and I will be making sure that I follow, like I am a president that and fulfill my role that in a way that is consistent with those regulations. But yes, I definitely think that there should be no, we should not tolerate any sort of violence or discrimination or stigmatism towards any of such groups on campus.
Maybe on that topic we can talk about Honi quickly. This year, as you probably know, Jackie was kind of in some hot water when he unilaterally censored Honi during the USU elections. What's your approach to censoring Honi? Obviously, as you've mentioned, defamation is the main concern, as it is every year with every president. How would you go about, for example, I'll give you a tangible example.
Sure.
We published a cover earlier this year, which you can see up there, in which George Pell is being hanged. How would that have occurred under your watch? Would you have allowed that cover to go to print?
Is that an autonomous edition? Or was
That's not an
that
autonomous edition, no.
Okay. Again, Honi Soit, yes, it's the official publication of the SRC, but at the same time, the editors, the writers, they have a right to, essentially publish what they want. I don't have to agree with what they have or believe in, what they write personally, but as long as it is not defamatory or does not incur any sort of legal concerns for the rest of the SRC, then it's not my place and it's not within my power, I think, legitimately to act out or censor it at all.
You expressed concern earlier this year in an article you wrote for the Sydney Tory that there were perhaps not enough conservative voices in Honi, both now and historically. Is that something that you would still, obviously there's sort of two different ways Honi could go next year, but putting that to one side, I'm sorry about that. Quickly turn that. Sorry, why it's doing
The
that.
printer's deciding to act up.
It really hasn't
I got
been
it.
Celebrating.
It's just that bottom on the, it's just that button here.
Yeah,
Amelia.
I was like, can I? Oh.
I'll go. So I think in terms of that article, if you read the article and when it was published, a premise of that article was saying that yes, it's one thing to maybe criticise the slant of a particular publication, but it's another thing, you can't criticise it and not pick up a pen and write. And so that was a premise. It was encouraging more people to step forward and partake in university discourse, because I think that we do need a balance. And the only way to, I suppose, balance the conversation that happens on campus is by making sure we have more voices and people are confident enough to step forward. So that was a premise of that article.
Is that something you'd actively seek to promote as president? Would you try to encourage more conservative voices to write for Honi, or is that not?
Well, it has nothing to do with my job as president of the SRC.
Okay.
That's something that I suppose you should be asking the people
Yeah.
that are running for Honi. I have no connection with the Honi.
I mean, obviously that the role of president has sort of, you're someone with a prominent public voice. Would you use that to encourage conservative voices to speak out more?
That's actually, it sounds ridiculous. It's you saying that I'm going to use the president.
No, I'm not suggesting you will or won't do anything. I'm just saying, in that position you have a lot of sway and people might feel emboldened, if the SRC is under your administration. Obviously you have a more conservative voice yourself. Would you, encourage students
I would encourage all students to pick up a pen and write something, for whether it's for any publication. It doesn't matter about, their sort of, because I think we do, you cannot, if a student is sitting there and complaining about, even let's talk about one of the more conservative, publications on campus, and they're complaining that it's, supposed to be, that it's not balanced enough, pick up a pen and write for it. It's just, but that has nothing to do with my role as president. That's just my own personal ethos, that I think that you can't complain about the campus narrative and not contribute to it in some way or another.
Can we talk about the environment,
Sure.
basically your policies? So, it's one thing to boost, any sort of initiative, but, quite another to actually sustain it.
Sure.
In your policies, you mentioned two things: the free SRC Keep Cup and bamboo straw sort of initiative, and also a renewable solutions science, business and engineering fair, which would involve a lot of STEM students. Can you expand on both of these, and also sort of talk to why you haven't gone down a more sort of traditional SRC, I guess, radical route of actual climate activism, given that we're in a climate emergency right now?
I think that, as I've been consistent in saying, that, we do have an obligation to our environment, and I think regardless of your, political background or private political views, this is something that all students on campus have an opinion on and feel strongly about. And so, you've got to remember that we have collectives in the SRC that are focused on this. You've got, and so, they've got autonomy over those sort of issues, and so it's not like my policy platform. I am very passionate about results, and I think that I would love to see the SRC move in a direction with that science, business and engineering fair for renewable solutions. I think, we're the oldest university. If we step forward and we step forward and we strive and we innovate and we create, it's one of the best ways of tackling this issue. As it stands, we have 128 million pieces of space junk floating around our Earth that are smaller than the size of 1 centimetre in diameter, and it's projected that by 2050 we won't actually be able to launch anything. And you ask, what is the relevance to students? We have students here that are doing space engineering that won't be able to launch their projects, their CubeSats, as part of their courses here. At the same token, you have 40% of the world's seas that are roughly covered in debris and junk that we've created. And I think we definitely have an obligation to step up and make sure that we are loud and proud in our strides toward solving that. And so both of those policies are very achievable, very practical, pragmatic ways of getting that done. I believe in the right to protest. I definitely believe in the right to protest, and I'm sure some point or another you're going to ask me about, the climate strike on the 20th. I believe in the right to protest. I think protests play a historic part in this SRC, but the future direction, the direction that our campus is undoubtedly moving in, is those sort of, because we're using student money, getting ways of them to actively be everyone being a part of this process, and really focus on outcomes and design and creation, which is what those two initiatives I think achieve. And we also, you've got to remember that this is just the presidential sort of broader vision. Within our bigger team, our Boost team, we actually have an environmental ticket that is headed by the president of Women in Engineering at the moment. She's incredible, and that team has gone and worked and put together policies. But honestly, I'd prefer for you to hear it from them, because they have had that it's just been this co-creative process where they've really taken a lead in crafting those policies. And so I'd love for you to hear it from them. I mean, I could talk about it, but yeah.
The interview's dragging on a bit. We might sort of wrap up soon, but before we do, it might be good to talk about your opponent.
Sure.
So obviously Liam has been at uni longer than you. You're a second year student. He's at least fourth in my, as far as I understand. He has a pretty impressive CV when it comes to the SRC. He's been on the Gen Exec, he's been a counsellor, he's been an editor of this paper. That's not to say you don't also have an impressive CV in regard to the SRC, but a lot of people might try to argue, particularly obviously their campaign might try to argue that greater breadth of experience is a reason why people should vote for him over you, what would you say in response to that?
I think it's a very narrow view of experience. You know, my experience is more than just on the SRC. I've juggled a lot for not-for-profit works. I've juggled a lot of jobs in my time. I've been very involved in a lot of clubs and societies on campus, and from that I have built up a very broad breadth of experience. I'm running with a very talented team. If we're going to talk about my opponent, I don't think it's quite savoury for me to personally back him out, but let's look at, you know, he might have an impressive CV, but when we actually look to, you know, commitment and what we've done with the roles. So this year I have been criticised by this paper for my attendance record, and I have had claims thrown at me that are not true. You know, in terms of the SRC, I've taken my commitment very seriously. I have the second highest attendance record of all unpaid members of the executive this year, besting even Prudence. And Liam, actually, when he was on the executive, he only attended 5 out of his 18 meetings. I've doubled that this year. And so again, my experience is far broader. For what I lack in age, I make up for in how active I've been. I came to this university, and in my first semester here, I was actively working. I have really good relationships with the staff. I was actively working with them to establish what you now see as DL student consultation committees. I lobbied together students. We had, I can't remember the exact number of students, a few hundred students put forward their opinions. I collated everything, did a big post, and was actually one of the students that was spearheading the establishment of those sort of consult committees. So I do have experience, I do have passion, and I have a very strong team who are all gearing up and supporting us from all sides of the political spectrum, and those who are independent as well, as you'll see. Yeah, and so I am not, you know, intimidated at all. I think I'm actually more experienced in that sense because I've had that broader, more holistic, practical lived experience.
You've called your opponents, or you've called broadly your opponents self-indulged radicals, to which I assume Liam Donahue it also applies to him. Despite that, you wouldn't know this yet, but you and he actually share a number of policies. The dedicated sexual assault lawyer is one of them. A plan to tackle student hunger is another. Mm-hmm. Is there anything you can see in Liam, or even just sort of the grassroots campaign more broadly, that you actually like and that you respect and value? Beyond just specific policies, but is there anything that you kind of have seen in them that you respect?
Like I've told you, you know, they've had a very active involvement in this campus's history, and they've played a part in where we are today. I think where they make their mistake is in using the mass amount of student money and pouring it into something that furthers only the minority, the loud bit minority. And so I think that, you know, they have a right to exist, and they should keep protesting. They should, you know, they have a right to do so, and I respect that, and will give them complete, you know, autonomy to do that. This is not me running to stamp them out. I think, you know, they definitely should exist, but I just think that we need to push the SRC forward. We need to continue to progress and take and shift the focus back, forward to where it should be, and that should be on students. The students are paying for the SRC. It comes directly out of their money, and you know, over the course of their university, they pay over $1,000 in SAF fee that gets funded into the SRC, and I think it's absolutely disappointing, and I think it's absolutely, you know, outrageous that money has been sent overseas. That money has been, you know, poured into, that money has been poured into so many niche social and, well, just so many niche issues that don't affect the broad student population. I think that's why we've got such a strong team this year, and that's, you know, we've consulted so widely and everybody is getting behind us, is because finally in us you have a team that recognises, yes, okay, that's a part of our campus history and it's not going to ever go away, but at the same time we need to put our focus on students, because students deserve better. Students deserve a better study environment. They deserve better student welfare, because otherwise, you know, why make university harder than it has to be?
Cool. Yeah.
Wrap up there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Great.